Hello and welcome to 11FS Spotlight. I'm David Brear, the Group CEO here at 11FS. In this show, we shine a bit of a spotlight on the best and brightest in the tech and financial services industry to try and understand what is it that gets them going, growing, and really what they think the future of the industry will look like. On today's Spotlight, I'm delighted to be joined by Pat Patel, who is the Executive Director at Elevandi. I don't know why I struggle saying that. You think with 11 in there, Pat, I'd crush that every time, wouldn't I? But you're joining me all the way from Singapore, so thank you very much for making time on what I understand is quite a get increasingly late afternoon in Singapore. So how are you doing?
Very, very good. It's the tail end of the day here, so I'm almost ready for the weekend. So this is one thing that holds me between my weekend. But yeah, it's great to be on here as well, by the way, because I think it's the first time. So yeah, it's a special moment.
Yeah, you've, over the years, you've been in the background of many of these. I know with various different things, and we'll sort of come to that as we go on. But first time you've had the mic, which is exciting. So what we're going to be doing for the listeners is talking a little bit about Pat's career. We're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into your role. And actually for what's really happening in Southeast Asia as well. I mean, the fintech scene has just changed dramatically, particularly as the regulatory scene has changed across the region as well. So we'll get a great view on that. But maybe if we start, Pat, really with for anybody who's not familiar with your company, tell us a little bit more. What's the elevator pitch?
Got you. So we are a company that builds bridges, and those bridges are between policymakers, regulators, and innovators and technologists, all framed around financial services. That's the reason why we exist. And there's a couple of things, when we think about Elevandi, you kind of take it back to, say, Web 2. The Web 2 world kind of was the convergence of mobile, social, and cloud coming together around about 2007, 2008. And these big companies kind of grew out from that area, so Airbnb, Uber, all of these types of organizations, a whole bundle of social media ones. And they did so without a dialogue with governments and regulators and policymakers. And as they grew, you've started to see a bit of a clampdown. You've seen it in Europe with the Commission. You've seen it in the US. You've seen it in China. And so we firmly believe that as we move towards a Web3 world, which is potentially AI, decentralized networks, but also quantum computing kind of converging on themselves, you need that policy kind of regulators dialogue. And so a lot of the things we're doing is looking at how do we help the growth and adoption of new technology in financial services. And the only way you can do that is having that dialogue with policymakers and regulators. And there's a learning curve on both sides there.
Yeah. And I mean, it's fair to say, isn't it? I mean, I think if you look at the goodness, since 2010 onwards, really, the regulation globally has really set the agenda for what can be done, and the innovation that we've seen in every region around the globe has really been, that agenda has been set by regulators being progressive or actually being restrictive in certain instances and certain regulators around the world. But I mean, it's an interesting concept though, as you say, because, the company was set up by the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So, I mean, that's a very progressive step to take to create such a body. And I guess to your point there, that innovation isn't happening in, one company or one silo, but it takes they say it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a whole region to raise great fintech.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you can imagine, it's not a well-trodden path to spin out from a regulator. So I joined in 2019, obviously, prior to that, 2020. And, when I joined, the mission was to put together a business case within MAS, secure seed capital, and then the third thing was build a team. So it's been some journey. So 2019, and then when we hit 2020, obviously everything stopped, and my whole team basically spent the whole year looking at how do we save our startups. Like, it had taken Singapore years to build, a fintech hub, and then clearly in 2020 it could have been decimated within months. So we spent a lot of time pivoting basically and looking at how do we set up relief funds, how do we support founders that were going through dark times, and trying to kind of raise capital in different parts of the world to come into Singapore. And that was kind of a really interesting time, very, absolutely worthwhile. And then when it come to 2021 is when we really got going and started to build the case. Clearly, it had to have many layers of approval within MAS and even senior levels of government. But we managed to get that. We managed to secure a small amount of seed capital. And then during this time, building some rock stars to come and join on this mission. And we finally spun out, I think it was the beginning of 2022. So I know it sounds like it's not that long. We're a year and a half, stroke 2 years really as a company. But the whole piece for this is how do you help regulators and policymakers to try and stay ahead of the curve? And then how do you really influence those that are building new products and services to really understand what these policy roadmaps and choices will look like? Because if you understand that, then you're not going to fall foul of new rules or laws that were coming down the line. And so that's kind of the DNA of what we're trying to do here. And, there's multiple threads, but I'm not going to answer all of it right now, I think.
Well, it's a fascinating thing to do as well. I mean, obviously, as you say, building any form of startup and, community-driven startup and bringing people together is difficult in its own right. But doing that within a large organization, we've built banks within big banks and actually the overhead that comes of that dialogue, those conversations. But really, it's not just about, I guess, what you're doing in the sense of your organization, but it's the cultural transformation, the learning, the opportunities that the broader organizations get as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's these nuances, I think, that make a difference in, and that's what we're trying to do is trying to find new ways to engage policymakers and regulators, get them feeling comfortable with some of the changes that are going on, but bring them into the conversation, bring them into the dialogue. And we do this through different formats, there's different ways to do it. On the surface, we have these big platforms that we run, like the Singapore Fintech Festival, but that's just the convening platform as we see it. It's the things that go on top of this, in the backside, in the back rooms, basically. Those are the things that really make a material difference. And right now, as you can imagine, the industry is quite a funny place right now across the world. Lots of challenging dynamics, but in every challenging dynamic, as you know from the financial crisis, there are absolutely lots of opportunities as well.
Yeah, I'd definitely say if anybody hasn't checked out the Singapore Fintech Festival, I was blown away. Actually being there last year and seeing the level of attendance, as in just sheer volume of people, but then actually the quality of the conversations that were happening on every stage was amazing. I think many conferences have become quite content poor. But actually, there was an amazing curation of people that were there. In fact, actually, my only challenge slightly was I was on the main stage after the Deputy Prime Minister, who mistook me for the AV guy. That was my only complaint of the entirety of the time. But it made for quite a funny story later on, which was good. But yeah, the sheer volume of that. Again, I sort of come back to Singapore. Singapore is playing a part not just as an individual country, but as representing the entirety of that region in terms of the opportunities, and it seems to be working, doesn't it? The talent, as you say, the funding that's coming into the region, and thus the success of fintechs in that space. It's always interesting when that happens. The part that actually one country's changes then affect not only local countries but much broader than that. The world sort of wakes up when you do something amazing. And I know you guys have been doing a lot more with leading sort of global dialogues across different organizations, from Singapore all the way through to Rwanda. You guys have been hosting events and creating conversations. What part of that? And is it almost, do you feel it almost like a responsibility? Because actually, you've found something that's really changing a region. Doing that in other regions is almost like I say, it's good citizenship from a global perspective.
Yeah, it's definitely got shades of that. And, we get a lot of opportunities come to us. People come to either the festival or one of our programs and they say, hey, can we have one of those in our country? And it's not as straightforward as saying, yes, we'll go ahead and do that. There's a purpose behind it. What we're looking to do is support Southeast Asia fintechs and kind of investors and kind of building corridors in new regions. So earlier this year was a year one debut in Rwanda. And so that was an amazing opportunity, not just for fintechs and investors, but also at the government to government level as well. And so it kind of starts to open a corridor for businesses on both sides to start really looking at opportunities and collaboration. And the one in Africa was absolutely beautiful for a number of reasons. So if I look back at my career, I recall that, and in 2012, 2013, when I went to my first Money 2020, the atmosphere in Vegas around this bubbling fintech scene, it was quite heavily payments driven, but you saw some of the crypto players, and there was an energy and a vibrancy that I've not seen before. I'd been to many Cybos events and some of the European banking conferences, but massively different. And that was kind of like an eye opener. And then, the one in Copenhagen in 2016 in Europe, you could sense this change occurring. We had one in Southeast Asia, so same again at Money 2020, and that was in 2018. And you could see there was a bubbling scene, and I hadn't felt like that since I went to Rwanda. And so when I went to Rwanda, there was this amazing energy that just literally catapulted me back to Europe, catapulted me straight back to Vegas, and it was something that kind of, and you just get that tingly feeling of just like, wow, this is, we're on the cusp of something quite special. And that was largely driven by founders and largely driven by regulators that wanted to know more, that wanted to have a dialogue. And a lot of the things we were doing in Rwanda and, conversations were happening were around how do you scale fintechs across multiple markets in Africa, because there is a regulatory layer there, but also a capital challenge, but then also, the confidence to be able to go to multiple markets. And Africa has produced some amazing businesses, but very few have scaled across multiple markets. So that was kind of one layer where we were bringing the right people around the table to try and get some level of harmonization. And then the second one that's super interesting is around digital public goods. And if you think about what India has built, which is the India stack, and that is a digital identity payments layer, and they have I think it's about 1 billion people on a biometric-based database, which is just absolutely insane. You have a payments layer, which is super sophisticated and open as well, an open architecture there. You have data exchange for financial and non-financial information. And then it's wrapped around a consent layer, which has always been a bit of a challenge, certainly in India and most markets. But if you have that stack, you have the fundaments of a digital economy. And so you don't need businesses trying to solve challenges because you have a creaky kind of infrastructure that supports economies, etc. And so that's something where there's been lots of interesting conversations across Africa, and the good folks at Moduloop and the Gates Foundation are kind of looking at great work across the region. But that's the piece where it was good to bring the public-private dialogue together there. And that's kind of something where if you can create change and you're part of that change, and you see where it's going to make a difference, whether it's inclusion or supporting businesses or entrepreneurship, that's the piece where, Elevandi really shines. And, it's one of the reasons why, I'm so excited about this, because working for a non-profit where, obviously we make revenues, but we don't have to give it back to shareholders. All it means is everything we generate goes back to our business and starts to kind of create new projects or products that we can expand into new markets with.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing, isn't it? As you say, the changing the dialogue there around, bottom up from a technology perspective and top down from customers' problems perspective. I mean, it's probably fair to say, since you got into the industry, you've seen quite a lot of change in that regard, because, we have gone globally from the big incumbent organizations really dominating all of those markets to actually much more of a sort of a tapestry of people trying to solve customers' problems. But what would you sort of highlight as the changes there? I know you talk about the different tech pieces, but as you say, the customer problems are fundamentally shifting, aren't they, as the world becomes, ever more complex?
Yeah. So we're seeing a lot quite a lot of entrepreneurs that have more of a moral compass than maybe the previous generation. And I think that's the bit that I find really heartening. The second piece I'm kind of seeing is around that breakup of that VC kind of value chain. Some would call it a Ponzi scheme. Might not even go there, but it's kind of broken down a little bit. And so what we're seeing here is a change in VCs and investors, the broader investor community, thinking more about profitability over growth. And that's something I know you guys have been talking about for some time now. And last year it was very pronounced, heavily pronounced. And so that changes a mindset massively. And so we're seeing a lot of founders building good products and services, but also doing it for good reasons. And that's the thing we've seen across parts of Africa and certainly across Southeast Asia and India. And if you look at what's going on, the growth potential certainly in India is absolutely insane. And some would say it's India's year, if not decade. You think about what's going on right now. They put a person on the moon, which has kind of elated the whole country. I think the country's on a national high. They may even have public holidays coming up for the next 2 weeks. But you've got the G20 there as well, which is creating a lot of opportunities for India, and a lot of the fintech businesses in this space are certainly benefiting. I do think in this part of the world in particular, valuations and rounds have been realistic compared to, say, some of the valuations and rounds that have been going on in previous years in Western markets. And I think that has just added a grounded kind of behavior to fintech. And I think that's great for the industry. And one thing that we really want to see, and that's part of what Elevandi is looking to do, is support some of those businesses to grow outside of their domestic markets or particular regions into other jurisdictions. And that's something we're really looking forward to. And we're beginning to see some of the signs of that happening, certainly over the coming 6 months to a year.
Yeah. And that sort of starts, not just, as you say, that starts not just from company A expanding out to, country Y and Z, but actually sort of influencing the way in which organizations, or the way in which countries think about financial services. And that's where I think, this is where I think me and you have always really aligned, is like, content and conversations and community sort of create that dialogue of having the almost bringing together that standardization of a view. They always sort of say ideas are easy and execution is difficult, but if you can at least get everybody to agree on the course of direction, and I guess again, this is where you guys sit in quite an interesting space, because you're sort of backed by the regulator, but you're deliberately sort of fostering those dialogues between the public and the private sector, and actually that's sort of not quite oil and water, like but actually they don't always speak the same language in terms of that. So, I mean, how important is that? You guys are not just providing a seat at a table to get people to come together. You're really creating dialogue, right?
Yeah. So no, absolutely right. It's two groups that rarely have spent time over the years. So you see regulators and policymakers spending time with bankers, but you rarely see them spending time with fintechs and technologists. And we're beginning to see that change. And, one of the reasons for Elevandi and its raison d'etre is to provide that translation service, because the more we can do to foster that bridge, and we do that through a variety of different products or programs, it really does start to kind of create an alignment, because you need an alignment between different regulators because you want a harmonization, but you need that alignment between some of the innovators and technologists that, some would say are 5 paces ahead or 6 paces ahead, but it's also, how do they communicate with regulators? And that's the translation service that we kind of offer, but we do that in ways which it creates a trust. We need the trust from regulators, otherwise they won't rock up. But you also need trust from the industry, and that's something where we're getting better and better at, and leveraging our network from the Singapore Fintech Festival, which kind of brings most of the boys and girls to the yard. So yeah, it's keeping it fresh, keeping it kind of challenging. But the bits that we one of the things we do very well is It's called the Insights Forum. And so we tag this along to our activities we do in multiple jurisdictions. We work with public sector partners, so whether it's the IMF or BIS or some of the central banks, and we work with them closely on curating a roundtable that will focus on a particular topic area, but with a set of tangible outcomes. And we've been nudging a lot of the regulators to kind of really think of those outcomes to validate some of their policy roadmaps or policy choices, or even, the equivalent of an industry consultation, which traditionally happens where you write up, you send out a response over email or via your site, and then people have to spend like hours, and, public policy teams are filling in these forms, etc., and sending it in, whereas we feel you need an interaction.
Yeah, I've often said to some of the regulators, I'm like, look, if you want to have like a 2-hour discussion, great, but I'm not spending 2 weeks of my life to fill in a form, right? So it's and like you say, it creates the wrong separation, doesn't it, in that way?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then what we do is it's Chatham House rules, and then we produce these white papers off the back of it to start influencing and shaping the thinking for other regulators that can't make it, because there are a lot of regulators, certainly across, some of the developing markets, where they're unable to kind of be a part of these dialogues, but want to be. And so, we make sure they get the insights that we push out, and we try and invite and cover their expenses to come all over, because I think the more people that are involved in this and the inclusivity behind it just enables fintech and financial services, a broader sector, to kind of flourish. And that's sorely needed right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talked a second ago about trust in that regard as well. That's something that's earned, right? But I guess when you deliver things, then people start to sort of see the benefit of not just what you're aiming at, but the way in which you're actually orchestrating these things. So, I mean, can you talk us through any particular successful partnerships? I know there's things like PayNow and SingPass that have really exploded in terms of the success of those things, and talk a little bit maybe about the permission that gives you, having seen those things succeed, to keep being bold, keep pushing forward.
Yeah. So PayNow is an interesting one. So I used to work for a company called Vocalink before it got acquired by MasterCard, and I was part of the teams that were putting this technology together. So not on the technical side, but on the business side and the strategy side. And, if you think that PayNow that we have in Singapore is essentially Payeem in the UK. It's a glorified database that connects, or proxy database that connects mobile phones to accounts. And so that is essentially that product in Singapore. But what they've done that is very, very clever is just opened up the access, so where it can be used. So it's not just a person-to-person transaction, it's a person-to-business, business-to-person transaction, government-to-person, person-to-government. So all of those kind of the P2P, etc. But what they've done on top of that is they've connected that to Thailand's system. So they've connected it to India's system. So what that means is I can send, all I need to know is John's number or David's number in Thailand, mobile number, and I can send a payment across within minutes, really. And I think that is the real innovation. So when you talk about collaboration, you've had the collaboration between the public and private sectors within Singapore, but then you've had that cross-border. And so you can understand the complexity. Doing it in one country is tough enough, but doing it across, getting an alignment between the government's level, but then also the industry level, was quite challenging. But that's kind of, gone really, really well. And there's quite a few kind of low value payment flows between Singapore and in Thailand, and then Singapore and India is a very big kind of flow of money. So that's kind of how PayNow has kind of grown, and I think it's certainly quite innovative. I don't know there's many jurisdictions that has something similar. And then you've got you mentioned SingPass, which is the identity system, and just having this, having landed in Singapore in 2019, knowing that I could just upload everything into my app, and then that is your identity, is just amazing, absolutely amazing. And it just makes things very easy to open up bank accounts, very easy to set up utility bills, but then even kind of non-financial services related items as well, where you can prove you are who you are, basically, based off a digital identity rather than a plastic card, which can be quite problematic at times.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Like you say, those two things There are on the payment side. I mean, there are equivalents of those things in various different countries. But I think that, to your point, the difference there is like the. I mean, it does take an amazing amount of emotional intelligence to kind of let go of something that into the system. And actually, all of the failings of that here in the UK was that it was being run by the big banks and almost a negotiation. It was like it was being run like a hostage negotiation. It was making sure nobody lost rather than somebody winning. Whereas actually, connecting the dots, both in terms of a closed loop system in a country, but then more open loop across different geos. I mean, that's a payment rails capability in any other description, right? So, but done through thinking globally. I mean, there's got to be airs there of some of the wallet capabilities in Africa, and that's the thing. I feel like you guys are not just looking to innovate for the sake of innovation, but you're learning from everybody globally where opportunities can be taken on and move forward and really benefited. But again, like you say, look, if you can identify yourself or an attribute of yourself, your age or whatever, and you can move money and you can do those things in a reasonably interoperable way across countries, you're in a really good place. I mean, I guess to that regulatory point and, where we are in this sort of evolving landscape as we sort of talk about, I mean, it feels like this is the direction of travel for everybody if they want to really create a vibrant ecosystem. So, I mean, how do you see that relationship changing? Obviously, we've had, the sandboxes explosion across the world. We've seen, open banking explode across the world. Are these all the direction of travel that you see continuing?
Yeah, I kind of think so. I think the UK has led the way in so many elements of it. I think it was the first to have a sandbox. It was the first to kind of have the modern day incarnation of a real-time payment system with faster payment service, and then building on top of that, and other markets, and in particular Singapore, has been a fast follower. And over the recent years, it's kind of then looked to steal a march on things by, replicating. And that's always the way things tend to work. You replicate. And then after that, you start to build capabilities and competencies. And then you start to look at new projects that are relevant to your specific geography. And that's the reason why those bridges start to come along between kind of Singapore and Thailand. It will be Singapore and Malaysia soon, and Singapore and India. But yeah, I think, I do think open banking, yeah, I find it a little bit challenging. It's been talked about for such a long time now. And when I go to India, they kind of laugh at the concept of open banking because they've already built it into their infrastructure. So if you have, as it were, the India stack or an equivalent of that, and this is 10-year-old technology now, but if you have a modern set of digital public goods, there is no need for open banking, because it's baked in from the onset. And so it's not a question of what banks will give up or not give up. It's already there. So you're able to access this information from the get-go because you have a trusted data exchange as one of your 4 pillars. The key bit here is around the consent architecture or the consent framework, which is always challenging. And I think it's evolving. I think India is getting better at this, but there will always be ups and downs with it. But in the main, it's kind of, it works. And then when you connect all this to your payments layer with, interoperability of payment systems, then you don't really need open banking as such. So I kind of firm belief that you've got this whole, the Payment Services Directive, you've got open banking, but if countries start to think about their infrastructure, their digital infrastructure, it could mean, and certainly what we're seeing in India is, then you start to see businesses innovating on top of this stack. And then you get some really interesting propositions, whether it's lending propositions, whether it's kind of value-added payment services, or even, wealth management services, and you can just pick a lot of this stuff up, or kind of the next step of insurance or car payments where you can get all of it bundled into one and you walk away with the car, it being insured, etc., or a loan happening, at the point of purchase. So there's a lot of these types of innovations happening. But if we look across, say, parts of Europe, a lot of fintechs are addressing the friction in those 4 pillars. And so you're always going to be putting band-aids on top of a creaky system, whereas you could start, put the investment in from the get-go, and then, your innovators and entrepreneurs can really start to think about new products and propositions that go above and beyond what consumers need rather than just the band-aid.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I mean, it's a metaphor that works in many other industry, doesn't it? I mean, it took Apple and Google to create great operating systems for mobile phones to allow millions and millions of people to be really innovative on top of that with applications, right? So, and actually, yeah, the innovation is almost necessary to make up for the stacks that are there rather than because of them, if that makes sense. And that's definitely the wrong way around. I think it's interesting, that tension between it comes the tension between the private sector and the public sector, because I mean the regulators have to sort of almost step in when they feel that the incumbent organizations are not addressing innovation in the way that they should do, isn't it? So it's always that tension of turning up the heat a little bit and making everybody a little bit more active and bringing a few more people into the market and overcooking everything in that way. But one thing's for sure, I guess the industry gets more and more exciting every year as the change happens, and that's always, I think, reflected in the types of people who are attending things like the Singapore Fintech Festival, which is coming up really soon, isn't it? It's November this year, isn't it? So what's the sneak peek? Is this a sort of a foreshadowing of the type of topics you guys are going to be covering there, or what's the plan?
Yeah, so a lot of the things we do throughout the calendar year is to take some of the people, the conversations, the continuation of that dialogue and bring that back to Singapore for the end of the year Fintech Festival. So we'll be bringing a lot of the communities and relationships from Africa and Europe across, but also some of the things we've been doing in Japan as well. So it started to kind of create a real global platform. And, the thing for us is, and where it's different than most other activities, it's policy meets finance meets technology. It's the nexus between the three, which we believe really can advance the growth and adoption of, And so this year, the thematics all around applications of artificial intelligence. It doesn't mean that's the only thing we're going to cover. We're going to cover digital assets and sustainability as a key part of that. We've decided to kind of go down a road of creating zones, because you were there last year. Sometimes it feels like it's your first day at school because the size of the halls are absolutely huge, and it just seems to be getting bigger and bigger. So we're kind of curate an experience. So if you're into your technology, you can go to the tech zone. If you want to check out what the regulators are doing across different jurisdictions, you can go to the reg zone, or there's a founders zone which has the founders peak, which I believe you delivered a killer presentation last time, and so that's going to be back and even bigger this time round. But yeah, from our perspective, we're looking to bring heads of state to the table. We're looking at some of the key bankers, but also the fintechs from different regions. And, we're quite fortunate that we get a lot of applications, certainly from Asia, and we're getting more now coming in from LATAM and Africa that want to be a part of this. So where I get really high off is when you uncover some of those hidden gems, startups or founders with just really interesting ideas and are kind of on their journey, but haven't quite made that break yet. And so bringing them to the festival is one of the things that we really love doing, and connecting them to the right people as well. We'd love to be able to join the dots and everything. Right now, we kind of, we have only XYZ capability and bandwidth. So we try and do as much of the joining the dots. And you mentioned earlier about joining the dots, and that is probably one of the most important pieces, whether you're joining the dots between governments or between industry and governments, and even between founders and investors. And, there's lots of programs that we have wrapped around this week-long festival. So, yeah, 65,000 people, kind of crazy fintech folks descending upon Singapore is not for the faint-hearted.
I definitely recommend, if anybody can get there, do get there, because it is an amazing show. And as you say, the things like the Founders Peak stage in itself, was some of the stories, sitting in the audience there listening was phenomenal. It was amazing to sort of hear the sort of trials and tribulations each business goes through, because actually when you sort of think of the heroes you talk about in the market, the Musks, the Steve Jobses of the world, you only see the result. You don't see the hard work and the grind that gets them to there. So hearing that firsthand from people who've got to the other side is pretty inspirational for a lot of people there, which is good. So what about you guys personally then? I mean, Pat, you were all over the world when you were doing various different things with 2020, and now you are as well. I mean, what's next for you, and what's next for the company?
So I thought I'd slow down, but it's definitely not going to be that way. So my plan was to be here for around about 3 to 5 years in Singapore. I'm kind of on year 4 now. It's gone very, very quickly, but there's still so much more to do. So I'm definitely going to be in this part of the world for longer. With Elevandi in particular, we are looking at setting up new businesses in new regions. So we have an opportunity in North Asia that we're looking at making an announcement in the next month or so. And then we're looking at Europe as well. There's an interesting opportunity. So one of our board members, Matthias Kroner, so the crazy cat that set up Fido Bank in the middle of the financial crisis. He's playing an active role in our European kind of expansion plans. So that's kind of 2 things that we've got on the table. And then one that's a little bit further out, but, I say further out in startup years, it's all relative really. So probably next year at some point is, putting the construct together for an impact fund, because we have access to a lot of interesting individuals and interesting founders, interesting people that are looking to set projects up between jurisdictions. And it's quite an easy lift to kind of start to connect them to the right capital. And so that's something we're really thinking long and hard about. But it's one of those things where, a year and a half old as an organization, we're still kind of crawling. So I want to make sure we can walk and a brisk canter before we start to run some of these things.
I mean, it would be a great time for that. As you say, the period of time, just after a crisis is usually the most innovative, isn't it? Because people really have to figure out new ways of making things happen. So there's going to be a lot of people looking for interesting capital in that period as well. But all right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Pat. I appreciate. We'll let you go get on with your afternoon, because it's getting into the evening in Singapore. But it does take us to the end of the show. So where can people learn a little bit more about you and in your business?
Sure. So Elevandi.io is our website, and Singapore Fintech Festival, you can kind of Google it and see what's going on there. We'll be doing a few kind of promotional activities around Europe. So and hopefully, David, you'll come over for the festival this year, and we can grab that long overdue beer.
Sounds good. Sounds very good. All right, that is all we have time for this week, though, I'm afraid. So make sure you follow 11FS on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok now, apparently, as well, to stay up to date on all of the cool stuff that we're going to be doing. And if you enjoy this show, do subscribe to the 11FS YouTube channel, where you can also catch all of the previous episodes as well. Have a great week, everybody. Goodbye.